Ladies and gentlemen, our session 1, which is design and delivery of adequate DC pensions, revised OECD core principles and private pension regulation. Our moderator is Mr. Ambrogio Rinaldi, Central Director, Pensions Fund Supervision Commission, COVIP, Italy, IOPS President. And I will call on the speakers, and as I call you, please come through and sit right here in front. Dr. Pablo Antolin, Head of Insurance and Pensions Unit, Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Big round of applause, please. Big round of applause for Dr. Pablo. Again, I would like to call you back, Mrs. Júlia Čillíková, Executive Director for Regulation and Consumer Protection, National Bank of Slovakia, and Chair of the OECD Working Party on Private Pensions.
Nobody's shaking your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're the only one that's shaking my hand. Okay. The stuff that politicians do. Anyway, moving on. And our last panelist for this session, Mr. Ali Khawar, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Department of Labor, the United States. Let's give him a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. This session, I'll just read the last part. This session will discuss, you can take your seats, right?
Okay.
Please feel free to take seats. Oh, you're going to come up? Okay. So this session will discuss main building blocks required for efficient functioning of defined contribution, DC pensions, as well as the role of pension supervisors in this process. The focus will be given to conceptual elements as described in the revised OECD core principles of private pension regulation and related recommendation of the Council for the Good Design of Defined Contribution Pension Plans. Ladies and gentlemen, our first session. Thank you very much.
Just to give you the rules of engagement of the section, we have 2 presentations that are quite substantial from Pablo, one also on the principles issued by OECD and Iops on regulation and supervision. We have also a PowerPoint presentation by Júlia that is also very rich of things, and then we will have the intervention by Ali. We would allocate about a little less than 20 minutes to each of these 3 interventions. And then the floor will be open for questions, and we would be happy if all the rest we have about half an hour to cover on your questions, and I will try to allocate the questions between the 3 speakers, or you will do it directly. So that's it. Maybe I will not refrain from making specific questions to speakers, but we will see how it works. So it is a very flexible, I would say, setting of this session. Pablo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambrogio, and first and most importantly, thank you to everybody for being here and for giving me the opportunity to present the OECD work. I will be moving and coming back and everything I like to move. I'm going to be explaining the way we work at the OECD to design and deliver pension benefits, and I'm going to focus on the design, but also on the importance of pension regulation. But I'm also going to explain how we go about with all these things, what is the OECD and how we work in the OECD. Because for the OECD, the member countries and the people who have to do regulation, supervision, and design are essential because we learn from you. And as a result of that experience, we have our legal instruments. So the OECD, the main function is to provide a forum for policymakers and regulators and supervisors to share experiences and to learn from each other. This is very important because we face challenges that sometimes are the same, but we have historical backgrounds, starting points that might be different, and things that might work in one place might not work in another place, and it's important to understand why, and this is the sharing of experiences. And this sharing happens or is channeled through OECD committees, and we work for the OECD Committee on Insurance and Pensions, where pension regulators and insurance regulators and supervisors share and discuss these experiences on how they address the different challenges that they face. So this is the general structure of how we come about with all our recommendations or guidelines for countries to improve their pension system. We tend to focus on pension arrangements where people's contributions or people's savings to finance retirement are invested in capital markets, they earn and return, and when people reach retirement, the assets they have accumulated are used to pay or to finance their pension benefits. We don't look to pay-as-you-go public pensions. There is another element, another section of the OECD that looks at pensions as public policy or social policy. So we only look at this type of arrangements. So we, as a result of all this discussion, all this sharing of experiences, we have two main OECD legal instruments on pensions that, as I say, we draw to develop them on how countries have improved their asset-backed pension systems, how they address their challenges, and we learn from that. And this is basically to have a strong regulatory framework that makes sure that the pension system works in the best interest of members and beneficiaries. This is essential because if the population do not feel that their best interest is the main reason for all of that, pension systems will not work and will collapse. And we have, as a result, the OECD core principle of private pension regulation that I will be talking about them. We also have another main OECD legal instrument that is linked to the design of the system, and again, we design in accordance to international good practices. We learn from what countries do to come up with policy guidance, and it's the OECD recommendations for the good design of these e-pension plans. So what is the purpose of the recommendation for the good design of these e-pension plans? As I say, our goal is to provide guidance based on country experiences on how best to design these e-pension plans. And we have 10 main messages. Some people might call them recommendations. We sometimes call them messages. The first one, and it's very important, is coherence. The system has to be designed in a way that takes into account all the different components that define or that will determine the retirement income of the individual or the society as a whole. But it has to be also coherent internally in the sense that you don't design the payout, the accumulation phase, and forget about the retirement phase. And if you design both, you design them in a way they complement each other. They are not separate blocks that don't have anything to do. Retirement is saving for retirement is a process that starts the day you join the labor market and it ends the day you pass away. And of course, it's very important, and this is essential, to design it in a coherent way with the objective. Different countries have different objectives. There are not best or wrong or worse pension system. It's different objectives, and as a result of those objectives, people will, each country will have a different structure and different goals to achieve. But we also highlight that the system has to be designed in a way that is inclusive. The minister just talked about informality. There are ways that we have learned from different countries how to provide pension arrangements in which people can save. All these pension arrangements have to be available for the population. Everybody has to be able to save, and it's very important that. And we discuss approaches. Obviously, in each of these main issues, there are guidelines of how to do it, experiences from different countries on how it has been done with the pros and cons, and it's also always linked to the key objective of the country. Contributions have to be aligned with the objectives. Sometimes contributions are high, sometimes are low, depends on the external coherence, what part is provided by a pay-as-you-go public pension system, or whether the asset back is the main element to finance retirement, or and also the capability to save for retirement that different segments of the populations might have. It has to be cost efficient. We also discuss issues about incentive, financial tax incentive, which is quite important. We talk about investments, there has to be options for people to choose, but also linked to the risk profiles, but also defaults to protect those people who might not make a choice, or because they don't want or they are incapable. The minister also talked about financial literacy, and this is one of the key reasons. So we talk about different approaches to achieve that. Some people talk about life cycle. Life cycle works if it's for the right objective. Obviously, on the payout phase, managing longevity risk, have good mortality tables. I was talking yesterday with Grace about mortality tables here. This is essential. They have to be up to date. They have to cover the right population. They have to have projections for future improvement, and they have to be updated regularly. We also have to have a structure of the payout. Are we going to have drawdowns? Are we going to have annuities? It depends on many, many factors. Communication, whether it's general or specific, it has to be for a specific purpose, is very important, and we have a lot of recommendations drawn from the experiences from different countries, and of course financial literacy. I'm happy to talk with anybody later on. I don't have time to go through everything in detail, but this is what we tend to do. What is the purpose of the core principle of private pension regulation? I just talked about the good design, now the core principles. Well, in the OECD, we have the message that pension funds and pension providers should manage, as I say, retirement savings in the best interest of members and beneficiaries. This is essential, and I repeat it, and I think it's important to repeat it. But also we are now, and we have heard in the speech of the minister, and in many countries are, should we invest in sustainable investments? Should we look into environmental social governance opportunity? Should we use all these assets to support the economy? Yes, the answer is yes, but the answer is yes as long as there is a strong regulatory framework in place, because the first message is essential. All of this has to be managed in the best interest of members. So it can be done, but we need the core principles for a strong regulatory framework. So as I say, these guidelines, again, they are distilled from the experiences of the different countries, and the purpose is to help, to assist, to provide options for countries to have a robust regulatory framework. There is not one way of doing things. We don't say this is the only way and that's it. No, there are different experiences, there are different approaches depending on the objective. Our goal is that policymakers, when they make a choice, they understand that each choice has pros and cons. And whether you choose one or the other, you have to be aware of them and the objective is very important. There are different goals and different approaches to achieve them. So are these core principles and recommendations for the good design fixed in time? Are they something that we come out one day and that's it? They don't evolve. No, they do evolve, because challenges, different challenges for pension regulators, for pension supervisors, for policymakers come along. Some time ago, nobody would have been talking about issues that we are talking today, sustainable investment and things like that. So digitalization, cyber risk, all those issues 20 years ago, we were not talking about them. So these principles, these recommendations evolve, and evolve because in the OECD we provide these fora to discuss the experiences that countries face when addressing these problems. And we evolve with that. And we are now in the process of changing and updating these principles and the good design. So they do things. The minister referred to the shift from DV to DC. That has gone and is going on in many countries, and it's a key issue in many countries. Some countries already provide experiences on how to address this challenge. There are many publicly sponsored pension plans that are coming out in many countries. Yes, the assets are managed privately, but they are publicly sponsored pension plans, like the AP7 in Sweden or Nest in the UK. The whole issue of diversification and investment regulation, we need to avoid too much country risk, but we also need to support the domestic economy. What about investing in private equity that might provide higher return, maybe with higher risk? Well, when we talk about private equity, what type of private equity are we talking about? Infrastructure, illiquids, all of this needs to be discussed, and we are bringing into the discussion. ESG, sustainable investment, isolated the governance structures of pension funds from undue political influence, address issues of conflict of interest that sometimes didn't exist and then they come along, risk management, digitalization, cyber risk, cyber insurance, I talk about that. So this leads to new revisions of the core principles and the recommendations after discussion and approval by member countries. So this is the process, and is based on real experiences in different countries. This is what we do in the OECD to provide or to come up with legal instruments to help and assist countries. Issues that are becoming relevant now. Well, the complementary asset-backed pensions has to work in the best interest of members. And as I say, the key issue is, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that real long-term return net of fees adjusted by risk and take into account the overall pension system. But a member and beneficiary, what is important for them is retirement income outcomes. How much retirement income will have the day he retires. And this is the best retirement incomes. Obviously, is linked how is invested and the returns. Again, diversification, not too much concentration, government bonds, domestically, I already mentioned that, the private equity and everything, those issues. Now there is discussion in many countries whether the regulation, one is quantitative regulation, which is in most countries, whether there should be a change in the limits to allow investing in alternatives. Probably yes, not too much, probably. And if you do not understand in what you are investing, do not invest. And we need to take into account that there is a lot of small and medium-sized pension funds that don't have a strong or don't have at all investment teams that can deal with this kind of issues. So we need to also take into account what is the structure of the pension market and the pension funds in the different countries. And of course, something very important, communication, how you communicate volatility, higher potential retirement incomes, how you communicate, this is important. In some countries, people tend to think, well, if we are going to put the money in the capital markets and this is very volatile, how can we be sure? All those kind of issues are very important. And the OECD recommendation for the good design does that. Incorporating HG, we obviously, how much time? Okay. Yeah, that was 20. Okay. So the key issue now, and the minister talked about that, is should we use assets earmarked for retirement to support the economy? Yes, as long as there is a strong regulatory framework, but also as long as there are suitable investment vehicles for small and medium-sized pension funds being able to invest in it. So I'm going to move quickly to the core principles, the strong regulatory framework, which is the issue, managing in the best interest of member, good governance, and there are many, many issues on good governance, and also supervision. So the discussions we're having now is, in the updating of the principle, is to expand the scope. We cover everything that is not pay-as-you-go pension plans, public and private managed pension funds. That's the idea. Publicly sponsored pension funds like the ones I say, and reserve funds like Canada, Japan, and Korea. But it's true that we focus on occupational pension plans and personal plans, in which contributions are used to invest, the earn and return and retirement income will be financed from the assets accumulated. We are updating to the new realities and development, the issues I already talked about them, and we work together with the IOPS on the principle of supervision, because we try to be together with them because they are the experts on supervision. We are more or less on governance. The structure is we have an introductory text where we have the scope, but we also say that countries can apply the core principles flexibly. Some countries might want it to apply to certain structures of the pension system. It depends on the pension structure of the system. Again, these principles, these recommendations are to assist countries to provide them with guidelines. Our countries are the ones that make a decision. Whatever decision they make, our goal is that they understand what are the implications. The first core principles talks about conditions for effective regulation. Link it to what I was talking before in terms of design. They need to be well-defined objectives on coverage, on adequacy, on security, on efficiency, and sustainability. Well-functioning capital markets, openness of financial markets, cost efficiency, dynamic and flexible. They need to adjust and improve as the process goes by. Countries learn, and they need to have flexibility to improve and to adjust to the new situations. And providers needs to be free from undue political influence. The core principle 2 talks about how to establish pension plans, pension funds, and pension entities. There is a lot of issues, but it focuses a lot of transparency and a proper set of legal, accounting, and technical, financial, managerial, and governance requirement. But of course, like everything, without imposing excessive administrative burden to providers. There is no perfect system. There are a balance always to strike out. There are a trade-off. Clear ownership structure. Core principle 3, focus on governance. Best interest of members and beneficiaries, repeating as I say, appropriate division, operation, and oversight responsibility, and the members of the governing bodies has to have fit and proper characteristics, not at the individual level, but the board as a whole, because they have to have an investment strategy, take into account long-term purpose, liabilities if there are liabilities, ESG investment, sustainability issues. Core principle 4, focus on investment and risk management. Pension funds at the end of the day invest, but they invest taking on board some risk, and one needs to use mechanisms or approaches to manage that risk, at least to understand what risk a pension fund is taking on board. So it addressed several issues. I'm not going to go through all of them. We are now going to have a discussion from two experienced people from 2 countries that have worked on how to apply this and will tell us. But all of this is fully available for free in the OECD webpage, and I will be here for 2 days to address any question from any of you that you might have, as long as I can. Sometimes I don't even know how to reply some questions. The core principle 5 is about plan design, plan benefit, disclosure, and redress issues. Core principle 6 is about supervision. It states many things, but for example, supervision should promote stability, sustainability, security, long-term investment, again the same message, good governance, again the same message, to protect the interests of plan members and beneficiaries, always in the best interest. Effective supervision must set up and focus on licensing, legal, and several factors that are very important. You have all of them. The slides are provided. The supervision authority should be adequately and properly staffed and funded in order to be able to conduct all their duties properly in the best interest of members. Then, after core principle 6, the core principle on private pension regulation have 4 more principles. 2 focus exclusively on occupational pension plans, and 2 focus exclusively on personal plans. The ones on occupational plans, core principle 7 talks about plan liabilities, funding rules, winding up, and issues related to insurance, and core principle 8 about access, vesting, and portability of occupational pension plan. The minister also talked about the importance, and he highlighted here in Africa, the importance of portability. And on personal plans, we have core principle 9, funded of personal pension plan, wind up and insolvency, and the last principle, equal treatment, business conduct, competition, and portability, again, portability of personal pension plans. So if I might say, we do address in these core principles and recommendations many of the issues that the minister highlighted as important. Obviously, as I say, we learn from the experience of countries, and of course those challenges are quite similar in most OECD and non-OECD countries. So to conclude, the design and delivery of pension benefits requires a strong regulatory framework that makes sure that the system works in the best interest of members. As I say, this is essential. No pension system will survive if people don't feel that the best interest is the key element in the design of the pension system. And the system needs to be designed according to international good practices, because we learn from the countries and we know why it works and what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. And just to highlight again that for us is very important, the OECD provides this forum for countries to share their experiences and learn from each other. This process and the related discussions have led to 2 legal instruments that we believe provide options for countries to improve their asset-backed pensions and also to improve the well-being of their citizens. And they are the 2 ones I have been talking about: the OECD core principle of private pension regulation and the OECD recommendation for the good design of DC pension plans. And thank you very much, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you. Again, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share with you my experience. Pensions reform is very close to my heart, because when I have a privilege that I was in the reform since the beginning. And when I signed the last authorization, I took the car, went to hospital, and my daughter was born. That's my daughter is like the second pillar child, and I have a nice memory. And the pensions reform or pension system is like the child. You have a lot of ambitions, you have a lot of wishes, but sometimes you should to facing the real experience. When Pablo asked me, or that's if I can be in the panel to sharing the experience with the core principles and recommendation of OECD, I start to think how to hold it, how to manage it. You have a few possibilities to make something like the FSAP, to take the list of the all principles, all of recommendation, and tick how we do it. But we will spend here the next few days. By the way, it's not the worst things that spend days in this beautiful country. But I decided to little bit structure what I want to tell you. As introduction, to remind you where we are, what is our system, how the reforms start, but I will be very brief, don't worry. And to tell you a little bit about the legislation changes in the second pillar, because we started 18 years ago, but it was like the storm of the amendment. And last but not least, I tried to cherry picking some core principles and recommendation. And before I will start, I will use something what Pablo mentioned in his presentation, that strong regulatory framework. Do you know why it's core principles for us very useful? Because they are like the puzzle, or they are like the open source code for the people who are doing the IT software. If you take all of these principles, and if you find the right order, you are able to make a relatively good regulatory framework. And what I really like, what Pablo used, is distillate from the experience of the regulators. That's definitely, it's targeting my favorite word, efficiency, sharing of the experience, saving the time, saving the sources. Okay, come back for my presentation. No surprise, we approved like the huge part of the East Europe, the Chilean model, and I am not so sure if we are not last where the Chilean models survive. Because second pillar, I prefer to tell it BISA 1. Because one of the main reasons why we introductions the reform is the increasing of the benefits due to aging and longevity. And if you start your reform, that you start to promise the Swiss pensions, greetings to our Swiss colleagues, that the reality could be a little bit different and people are losing the trust. Third pillar is voluntary saving, which is, by the way, I think the excellent way how to motivate people who are able to saving to do it. Come back for the incentives, which was mentioned in the core principles. And last but not least, in the Europe, we introduced pan-European pensions products, which promised us the efficiency cross-border. It was something that what your minister mentioned in the presentation, but we are in the beginning, and I believe that we will be able to share the information later. What to add? Maybe that for these slides, only two figures. That's under the management in the second pillar is already 13 billions, and NAV, and the third pillar is a little bit less, that's something more than 3. But if you heard that 13 billions, can you feel like the politicians, how attractive is it? And I sometimes a little bit afraid that pensions is long-term products, and sometimes the politicians should to settle the gaps in the short term. I think that is one of the challenge. I told you that about the introductions, the second pillar, also with my personal story, and a third pillar already exists. We start with a private saving immediately after the changing of the system, but in that time it was the some insurance, and we very quickly to remove from DB to DC. General principle in practice that since the beginning of the second pillar, we use these core principles or recommendation of the authority like the manual. And we try to incorporate it, all of these principles in some way into law or into regulation. And I can tell you that it's a strong argument for a policymaker that if you find that I need this, this is a general or a international recommendation. And but you normally have a feeling, okay, I am complying, but sometimes it's real enforcement give you the better view that you should to change a little bit something, or as I mentioned, that some changes was reasonable, some changes was totally crazy. If you only read that what's happened, you can pair for the principles, but what was the real mistake is the changing from the automatic enrollment and possibility to leave, from the voluntary enrollment and the possibility to entrance. Because our lesson learned is people are very passive. If you, I think that predefined enrollment is a crucial, and it was also in the core principles. And maybe to add that we try to give into regulation a lot of transparency, a lot of information, but if you make some survey, what the member of the schemes know about their pensions, I don't know if you will be surprised or not, but not very much. We was in the one conference and we asked the experts from the markets, who knows, in which fund they are saving the money. And people was not sure. But the mistake, or the politicians decided that they will solve it and it will be clear, and everybody will be removing the high guarantee funds, and only the active people left from the more risky fund, and this is only one who had some kind of profits, but it's a different story. In this slide is only the list of the core principle which Pablo mentioned, but I will remind it in the more slides, because I think that it's reasonable to think that these principles exist, and you can find in your regulation in the different place the content, how to do it, how to fulfill this requirement. General principles in practice. That we have a second and third pillar is managed by the management company, which more or less fulfill the similar requirement. What about the supervision? What about the authorization? What about the governance and so on? Maybe that I would like to add in these slides that we could also find the inspiration for the other international organization, because still some kind of principles, like was mentioned the first 6, it's more or less applicable in some way cross-sectorally. Not copy-paste, but you can find the inspiration. You have a main requirements for pension saving entities, and I think that you can easily pair for the core principles. Again, for the introduction, this is these general principles which was mentioned, which was And I give you the example. We are doing the supervision like the National Bank of Slovakia. We are central bank. We are integrated authority, cross-sectorally, and also responsible for the consumer protection, resolution, and financial education, which is, by the way, I think that very efficient way for the small market and with the limited sources. Our main task: licensing, supervision, sanctions, regulation, and education. Again, you can pair all of these main tasks with these general principles. What to add? That's about the licensing and supervision. We can mention the few sentences that is generally done, but we always facing the new challenging, because this looks for the supervision. New technology are coming, and it was mentioned, subtech, fintech, clouds. We in the Europe try to solve it via the new regulation, but I can tell you it's not easy to find the appropriate stuff and to understand the sector. And this is again the good example that some task could be done into more integrated approach. You can find the people. And maybe the benefit for us that we are not, the regulator is the Ministry of Finance, but we have as the central bank directly into the regulation that we can issue the secondary regulation, and we should to some way approve the regulation or to have an opinion for the regulation. Last but not least, I will add a little bit more about the education, because this is also my favorite topics. We start to fulfill the gap on the market, the education, because financial literacy is one of the crucial things. I can tell you, I don't know if it is a cultural things or if it is everywhere. People sometimes are a little bit lazy to read, understand, or to make some effort. And in the case that they make the mistake, they try to find somebody who is responsible. They try to believe that some big authority will take care about them in the every reason. But it's not true. We also, as I mentioned, we are responsible for the consumer protection. But if I can tell you that 80% of complaints are totally out of, that people don't know what they signed, and they give us this power or this idea that we should start. I don't want to tell you how we negotiate with the Ministry of Education, who is more responsible, who is less responsible, because it's for another story, but it's a nice job. It's not such an easy, you don't have an immediate outcome, and some expert can tell you that if you compare amount of effort and money which you give in this activity and outcomes, that is not always such a positive how it looks like, but let's do it. Come back for the core principles. That's principle 2 and principle 5 and recommendation 2 and 5. Make this system as inclusive as is possible. I'm coming for the new last regulatory changes, because we try to repair what was done in previous time. And I can encourage you, try to use every regulatory authority to go deeper in the core principles and take the lesson learned. Ask your people, ask your supervisors, ask the people from the consumer protection, or maybe the consumer protection's body, if you have this. Ask what could it be better, what could be make the problem. Ask your people from the sanctions department, ask your people from licensing department, and go deeper into the regulation. What was, I mentioned, automatic participation, that is crucial for us, and the role of the social insurance agency. that's informed to everybody who automatically participated, that's about right and obligation. We are doing a lot for the sharing information publicly and also the personally. We had a discussion if it's efficient because, you know, to send a personal letter, which I'm a little bit afraid that 50% of people will not open, but we will see. And new individual guarantee is something, how to say, less strong, this previous, that because nothing is free of charge. And if you have a strong guarantee, that you cannot expect reasonable profits because, you know, it's not too easy to take the responsibility for losses. Promote low-cost and cost-efficient retirement arrangement in both in the accumulation and paid out phases. It's very sensitive topic for the small markets because some costs are fixed, and it doesn't matter if you have under management 1 billion, 13 millions, or billions. And we can discuss about the proportionality because it's not too easy to be competitive, and it's for the separate discussion, what kind of fees are fair, which are not fair, and how to manage system properly. And payout phases is, again, the big topic because we spend a lot of time about the requirement for the saving, but for the requirement for the payout phases, this is the time when people woke up, and if you send him the calculation of their future pensions, they are shocked. And they are very surprised, but it's easy math. If you have a small saving, you should not be so surprised that your pension is low, but it's happened time to time. A little bit about recommendation 6 and core principles 5, and its default investment strategy. I told you that we had a totally wrong strategy, and 90% of investment due to some stupid changes was done in the very conservative investment, which, by the way, now the politicians time to time use that if you compare the conservative investment, for example, with index funds, and you compare the difference, that is something what company stolen, but it's not true. But now we have, I think, a much more efficient way, which follows some life cycling, and also we introduce these passive investments. Again, the topic passive investment or passive management is a topic for the separate meeting. Darius asked in the technical committee or AGM what kind of topic we would like to bring on the table for the next time. I can tell you it's a lot of them. Last but not least, information obligation and education. I think that information obligations are very important. We have also a lot of discussion in Europe about the unification, how to deliver. If the unification bring the better understanding from the clients. We also use, we call it orange envelope, which is the very easy way how to deliver the basic information and the performance and calculation of the future pensions and the different scenario. And it works, but hands to hands with education. I told you that we introduced our program, and we invest a lot of money and energy into the own project. We call 5 peňazí, like the 5 corn or $5, however you want. And we try to cover all sectors and all generation, but we're taking a lot of efforts for the pensions. We have a calculations, calculator set. We are doing the seminars, workshop. We have a very close cooperation with school. because it's too late start to solve the pensions when you receive the first envelope that your annuity is in some kind of sum. Last but not least, because what about the education? I also prepare for you fairy tale, but I'm a little bit afraid that I don't have enough time, but I send you the link. It's a lot of fun. And ESG factors. We really welcome the activity of the OECD because we start in the Europe with something, and I'm real fan of this, but it's not easy to find a single approach. You should to collect the data, analyze the data, to have a same understanding or similar understanding because what could happen? Greenwashing or unrealistic expectation and a lot of open questions. As I mentioned that we already start in the Europe, we use the Iops supervisory guidelines. It's very crucial for us. We already issued our own recommendation, including ESG factor. And it's a duty that all supervisory entity should apply the regulations about the ESG factor. But challenge is find the proportion and criteria for green financial instrument. We spoke that it's important for us to speaking together. But I think what about the new regulation or new challenges is also too important to speak with the market and listen what could be the problem with application. Because otherwise, we produce the 1,000 paper of the recommendations and the answers are very strange. What we are doing, we have some transparency approach that we issue the idea, like we are doing here in our international organization. We start first document, public discussion, presentation, collections, first wave of the comments, seconds, but finally we issue and we enforce it. And that is all for today. Thank you very much. And one more time, I strongly recommend to use all of these available knowledges, which are, I like it, the distillate of the, from experience, and to provide a good outcome. Thank you very much.
Let me start with an apology. Because of my distaste for slides, I'm going to force you to look at me for 20 minutes. Apologies, I'm not better looking, but maybe I'll go and stand close to Pablo and Ambrogio for a little while and Júlia so that you can look at them instead. So I want to give you a sense of the US system, which is a bit older maybe than some of the other systems that are in the room, and some of the lessons that I think we've learned. And I would tell you that I think from my perspective, when I think about things like the core principles, the good design principles, recommendations, it really, as you heard from Pablo, is very informed by the real experience from jurisdictions around the OECD and around the world. And I can't really commend them to you enough, particularly those jurisdictions that are earlier on in their process and really thinking about these questions from the ground up. There is a tremendous amount of material in those recommendations that I really encourage you to absorb and to engage with both secretariats, Iops and the OECD, because I think you'll find they're very, very happy to provide all kinds of technical assistance. So the US system, I'm really going to talk about Pillar 3, but just to give you a sense of the broad strokes of our system, we have kind of a Pillar 1 broadly available for working people in old age, public pension system. The Pillar 3 system is an important component because the thinking in the United States is that when you're talking about retirement savings and ultimate retirement security, we don't talk about the pillars, we talk about a three-legged stool. And the legs of that stool are the Social Security, that public pension system, your personal savings that you've accumulated over the course of your life, and the savings that you have through your occupational scheme. So the big reform that happened in the US was a federal law that was passed in 1974 that created the modern framework for our Pillar 3 system. At the time that it was passed, the overwhelming majority of the occupational schemes were defined benefit pensions. But we have seen a transition, as many other jurisdictions have, of defined benefit to defined contribution, and I'm probably telling you things that you already know, but that change, that means that you move from professional asset management to individual decision-making. And the individual decision-making portion has been described in the US as really representing a great risk shifting, because you now have longevity risk, of course, but you have inflation risk, market risk, all kinds of investment risk that individuals are now taking on and responsible for. And they have to make decisions now about how much to save, what they're going to invest in, and then when they reach the age of retirement, how they're going to manage whatever assets that they've saved up over the remainder of their lifetimes. And there are issues that we see very frequently around people being very concerned about bequests to their children. And that's an issue that we have to constantly navigate, because that kind of pushes against people choosing lifetime income streams. So to give you a couple of stats about our system, there are, in the occupational schemes, there are about 800,000 of them, of these occupational schemes. The vast majority are DC. There's, I would say, probably about 730,000 of them are DC, and about 50 or 60 DB schemes. They hold in aggregate about $12.5 trillion, and they cover about 150 million people. One of the things I'm excluding from those stats is there's a way in which you can have an individual retirement arrangement. There are about $12 trillion or so in those arrangements, and the big source of that is movement from the occupational schemes into those individual retirement accounts. It's called a rollover. It happens frequently when people change jobs or when they retire. So I think maybe stepping back from the OECD principles, one of the things I would stress as kind of a design principle that is embedded, I think, in a lot of what the OECD and Iops talks about, but is constantly on our mind as we're thinking about these questions, is one of kind of systems design. And the question is, one, how can we maximize coverage? Because these occupational schemes are voluntary. The second, though, is how can we have a system that works as well in the background as possible, and taking a lot of that decision-making away from individuals, so that it's operating in kind of as functional a way as possible, but at the same time preserving as much choice as possible, because in our occupational schemes in the DC system, people are very adamant about being given the freedom to do what they want to do. So that again, kind of embeds a lot of our thinking and a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. But I want to talk about like 5 or 6, depending on how far I get, different areas for us where we've done things over the years, either legislative changes, regulatory changes, enforcement efforts that we've made to address different areas. And as I talk about this, you're going to hear, although I'm not going to tell you this is core principle 1 and this is core principle 4, you'll hear a lot of echoing of what you heard from Júlia and what you heard from Pablo earlier, because it is embedded in all of this. So the first thing is coverage. So since 1974, on a population-wide basis as a percentage, there have been a lot of efforts to try and increase the coverage of this Pillar 3 system. And as a percentage of the population, the numbers haven't really fluctuated all that much. But we have made a lot of efforts over this. So there have been new forms of occupational schemes that have been introduced. because the notion has been frequently that, you know, the kind of scheme that you're offering doesn't work for certain kinds of employers, and so what we need to do is offer them something that's either simpler, less administratively complex, maybe shifts some of the administrative burden to a central authority is the most recent innovation here, where it's kind of a group arrangement, and a lot of the administrative work is happening at a central body. So far, those things have not really succeeded in really dramatically changing the scope of the voluntary coverage. But it's important to know that those are there. And one of the conversations we're having right now, you know, the minister mentioned the informal sector. We have what we would call non-traditional workers, people that don't have a traditional employment relationship with their employer. The example you can think of is someone that works for Uber, for example, which is an app that you can use to order essentially a private taxi. Anyone can sign up if you own a car and it's not, you know, 30 years old. They'll let you sign up. You can get people request drive. You're not technically considered an employee of that app sharing company, but you are deriving income from it. And there's not really a simple way that the current structure, which is based on employment relationships, accommodates that. So that's an ongoing conversation for us. A lot of the work on coverage and access over the years has happened through tax policy. So there are incentives for employers, there are incentives for employees to encourage them to offer a scheme, to encourage them to save or save more. And so there's a number of examples of those kinds of tax incentives that we have. Another part of the work on coverage is also around education, right? And we are putting, and I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the educational efforts that we have, but that's an important principle here. Related to this question of coverage, you know, I would say within the last 5 years, increasingly, there's been a very robust conversation emerging in the United States about how equitable the system is. This concept of equity has been built into the system from the very beginning, mostly through a tax lens to make sure that there's not what we would call discrimination. It's not discrimination based on the color of your skin or something like that, but it's kind of a financial discrimination, because one of the concerns that people had is that the benefits of these kinds of occupational schemes shouldn't simply go to the highest paid employees. What you need to make sure is that there's some proportionality and that you have lower paid employees also benefiting from these schemes. And so there's been a lot of work in the tax policy process, but more recently, there's been a broader conversation about these issues of equity that have really begun to focus on issues like gender and race. And when you look at the statistics, you see that the coverage is not equal. So non-white individuals in the United States are less likely to work for an employer that offers an occupational scheme. If there is an occupational scheme, auto-enrollment, which I'll talk about in a minute, has addressed a lot of this, but they're less likely to affirmatively adopt and enroll in an occupational scheme. And that kind of question is really motivating now another round of questions around how can we address this coverage thing. And so pretty recently there was some legislation passed that addressed one issue, which is people who work part-time. And people who work part-time for an employer for a certain number of years, now the tax system has been changed so that it's now a mandate for employers that offer these benefits to make sure that those individuals are covered. But there's other things that have been in place, as I said from the beginning, provisions around vesting of your contributions or the employer contributions, this concept of non-discrimination testing to ensure that the highest compensated employees aren't benefiting too much, limits on the amount of contributions you can make in any 1 year. Again, that's for a similar principle of making sure that there's a bit more economic equity and progressivity in the system. Next thing I want to talk about is contributions, which is an important part, I think, it's particularly in a voluntary system where you don't have as robust a safety net in the United States as you do in a number of other countries. It's an important part of making sure that there is adequate retirement income. And the two innovations there that you've seen are auto-enrollment and auto-escalation. And there's again been a legislative change that means that Going forward, starting next year, all new schemes are going to be required to have auto-enrollment in them. It was made voluntary a number of years ago, about 15 years ago, but now it's going to be mandatory on a prospective basis. And that's an important thing that we found, again, thinking about this question of equity. You deal with some of these issues by making sure that people are defaulted in and you take advantage of that kind of human behavioral bias. Related to contributions, there's another issue that we have that we refer to as leakage. So when you leave an employer under our system, you're able, as I mentioned earlier, you're able to move your money into an individual scheme. You're also, for good or bad, able to withdraw all of the money. If you have a loan, because you can take a loan against your retirement account balance for certain reasons, if you haven't repaid that loan, that's counted as a distribution that you're taking. And there are tax penalties and things to discourage this kind of behavior, but we have the same problems with financial literacy and people making not necessarily the best decisions, as I would say probably every jurisdiction does. And so this question of leakage is again an issue that is a really, really significant concern. The estimates range, but at the higher end, it's that up to $1 trillion is lost to this leakage, where the money isn't staying in the tax-qualified retirement system. It's not that it disappears. People still have the assets, minus a pretty significant haircut that they're taking because of the tax penalties. They have the assets, but it's not tax qualified, and it's not really retirement savings anymore. It then gets used for other household expenses, some of which may be very meritorious or not. I'm not really making a value judgment. But the purpose of the system is to encourage retirement savings, and it's definitely not part of that system anymore. And so there are a few things that we've been working on in that space. One is the ability to make sure that as you move from employer to employer, your pension can more easily and seamlessly, again, this concept of a system that works well in the background, that it can move with you. And so we have a rule that we'll actually be proposing before the end of the year that is going to allow for a system where, as long as the financial institution has a relationship with the employer, and the new employer, doesn't have to be the same financial institution, they will in the background be able to move your assets from your old arrangement to your new one. You'll have the ability to prevent that from happening, but again, because part of what we're dealing with is default behavior, lack of engagement, people don't really want to think about this stuff. They think it's too complicated, they think it's too scary, they think it's too boring. They clearly haven't been to any Iops meeting. And as a result, you just need these things to kind of happen as defaults in the background so that the outcomes are better for the participants. So there's that auto portability piece. We also have a problem in the US of pension assets, frankly, getting lost. So individuals move from employer to employer, particularly for younger workers. It's very, very common to job switch. And what happens is over time, they lose contact, they don't update their address, any number of things happen, and the employer that they worked for when they were 24, 25, they've got some money saved in an occupational scheme there, it didn't move with them, they're now 50, they don't even remember where they worked, that company has gone through mergers, acquisitions, all kinds of things, that corporate body doesn't exist anymore, and the fiduciaries of the occupational scheme haven't really done a good enough job to keep track of those people, because actually it's their obligation. But we again see this as a pretty significant problem, and so we've had a lot of enforcement success on that issue, but we are also in the process of building a system where individuals will be able to query and see, we'll be collecting information from the private sector, and individuals will then be able to query and see whether they have assets that are held in another retirement plan. That won't be online for a few years because there's a lot of kind of data collection that needs to be built. And you're not swimming? Tiger fishing? For this? And so that'll be online within a few years. The last thing on this leakage point that I would stress is one of the issues that we see leakage, particularly, again, this concept of equity and thinking about what we would call vulnerable or underserved communities, the people that haven't necessarily been well served by their government over the years and face all kinds of systemic discrimination. Their financial needs are pretty significant and different than other workers. And the debts that they have to pay, the income that they have is also very different. And so the whole profile of these individuals looks very different. The consequence of that is that even when they save for retirement, they are much, much more likely to be victims of this leakage problem because they are going to tap into their 401k or other occupational scheme, pull out that money because they're not making enough money on a monthly basis, right? They have other bills that they need to pay, they have other things that they need to use that money for. That again drives this really significant problem. And so they're again, something that was already legal, but there's some legal changes that have been made to really encourage the emergency savings arrangements, where employers will be able to, and there are a few different ways that they can do this, but the one that I'm most excited about is tied to the occupational scheme. They'll be able to save there and withdraw it without penalty, and it kind of is a way that they can have a relatively small amount of money available to them. In the US, people frequently, the stats are not encouraging. It's, I've forgotten them. It's something like 70% can't afford, or 80% can't afford a $1,000 emergency cost. Depending on what dollar threshold you're talking about, 500, 1,000, 5,000, the numbers are kind of proportional to that. They're not encouraging really at any level. We tend to think about this as a lower income problem, but the truth is it's not. It can be any income level because as your standard of living changes and your expenses change, your ability to absorb that kind of economic shock may be limited even at surprisingly high income levels. But this emergency savings program, the hope is that by having that, people can get over that very short-term issue, can have money that isn't really intended to be part of the retirement system. And the hope is that because some of these people choose not to enroll in schemes in the first place, because they have concerns that the tax penalties and the ways that their money is locked up mean that they won't have access to it, that it can really address that fear and get more people into the system. So again, one of the things that you're hearing time and time again, even on the things that aren't formally about coverage, is this question about coverage. Another thing that you're going to be hearing again and again is that even though we've moved from a DB to a DC system, there's been a constant quest to think about how we can get some of those benefits of the DB system into the new arrangements. Because some of these problems just didn't exist in our prior arrangements. I'm going to skip, I was going to talk a little bit about transparency and disclosure because we've done a fair amount of work there and it's been quite successful in driving down costs, but I'm going to skip over that because the one other thing I wanted to touch on is oversight and risk management. There's two ways, I think, well, more than two ways. I'm not going to put a number on it because I'm probably going to end up at 8. So some of the ways in which we address these kinds of issues of oversight, risk management. First, it's important to just lay out that we have a fiduciary structure. The fiduciaries, the plan officials that are responsible or related officials that are responsible for decision making, they're held to a high standard. They have legal obligations. There is both private enforcement potential and government enforcement potential. We're relatively small compared to the universe that we regulate, but we have a pretty substantial enforcement staff, and we do both civil and criminal enforcement. Putting aside those kind of fundamental legal obligations, though, we look at our work through also a regulatory lens. And some of our regulatory work is really aimed at making sure that there's proper accountability. So we've done work on addressing financial conflicts of interest in the provision of investment advice, our work on ESG and making sure that plan fiduciaries understand how they can incorporate ESG into their pension schemes. All of that work is part of our kind of regulatory approach. But there are a number of other regulations that we have that feed into our enforcement program or feed into what we would view as a well-functioning system where there's transparency and accountability. And so a couple of examples of that, we have registration requirements, reporting requirements to the government. We have disclosure requirements where information is disclosed to participants, but also to make sure that information is disclosed to plan fiduciaries, because the fiduciaries of these schemes aren't all equal. And I'm not making a comment on their relative skill, but the relative assets that they hold changes their market dynamics and their ability to negotiate and get information sometimes. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is make sure that we're requiring that information is disclosed to them, because they're going to be held accountable, as I said, for the decisions that they make. If we're not making sure that they're not given the information, then people can rightfully be critical of our approach. There's also, I mean, this isn't us, but I also wanted to mention there's work on the tax compliance standpoint, because the tax incentives are such an important part of the system, and tax abuse is obviously a concern to the government. I also wanted to talk about education, because I think that's an important piece of what we do. It's not just about kind of the financial literacy issues that have come up a few times, and thinking about those concepts and making sure people are educated. We also do education to employers to encourage them, to make them aware of the different kinds of schemes that are available to them, encourage them to offer them. But it's not just those kinds of things. It's also important that participants, the general public, are aware not just of the government agency that exists, but also that that they know what their rights are. Because we have, I mentioned we're kind of small relative to the universe that we regulate. The numbers fluctuate, but it's about, we have one investigator for about 12,500 occupational schemes. So we know we're not going to be everywhere. We know we're not going to be able to look over everyone's shoulder. And so as a result, one of the things we think about from an enforcement standpoint is how we can kind of maximize our potential and have a multiplier effect by looking at service providers or financial institutions rather than individual schemes where possible. But another part of it is also making sure that the participants themselves are educated. Sometimes they're able to resolve disputes, sometimes they contact us and we can informally resolve disputes. But they're also, through that education, a very rich source of leads to us. It's actually a significant contrast to Júlia's point, because the largest single source of investigative leads for us that result in us opening an investigation actually is originally from calls that come in from the public that we were unable to informally resolve, or they said something that makes clear that there's a criminal violation or something serious enough that we would skip over the informal complaint resolution. But ultimately it ends up in our enforcement program. And so it's interesting to hear you say that, because our experience, I mean, there are people that call with very strange requests or things that we can't do anything about. But for us, we've actually found that to be quite helpful as a way to make sure, again, that the system can work as well as possible when we're not going to be there to see everything that happens. So with that, I actually am hoping we can just have some open conversation and have questions from the audience. So I'm going to stop. And the good news is now you get to look at my co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you very much, the three of you. Now we open the discussion to all the floor. I will actually wake up and get the other microphone. It would be more practical for me. So you can ask the questions you want to the speakers that you want, that you wish, or you can just ask the question and I may select the appropriate speaker, or I may even try to offer my own views. So who is the first to break the ice? There is no ice here actually, but at least in the air. Here. Actually, I saw one first over there, and then I will go in the sixth row. Yeah, you. Could we arrange a microphone? Yeah, perfect. Could you present yourself, please?
Hi, good day. I'm Zarina. I'm from...
Could you stand up?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Please, otherwise it's a very large room. It's more practical this way.
I
Thanks.
understand. I'm from the Financial Sector Conduct Authority in South Africa. I think the question might be for you, Mr. Rinaldi, or for Ali. I just wanted to know, in respect of the non-traditional or informal sector workers that you've referred to, how do you deal with those in your jurisdiction? That's the one question, and I don't want to hog because I know there are probably many other questions, but another question that I have, and I think for Ali, is that now that you're allowing access, it appears from your funds, so that it encourages members to remain in the funds, are you coupling that with compulsory preservation? Because that is basically what South Africa will be doing shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, let me say just a few words on this issue of the informal sector from the experience of my country, but also possibly in general. In Italy, actually, we have a problem. We have a big problem on that because actually in the more developed countries, let's say, Italy is one of those that have the largest informal sector, and also, I would say, also a relatively large self-employed sector, and the distinction between the two sometimes is a kind of blurred, as I was saying also in other occasions. It happens to be that the way our system was designed had a lot was in the moment the system was designed, the trade unions of employed people had a very important role. And they are actually in the boards of the occupational pension funds in Italy. And frankly, they take care quite well of the first principle that Pablo was mentioning, to run the pension funds in the interest of members, because they are the representative of the members. And they, for instance, they are quite effective in negotiating good conditions with the asset managers and all the other providers of the pension funds. So basically, the way they are organized, they have the structure of the governance of the pension scheme very concentrated, but most of the operational activities are outsourced. And they take care of finding good providers, and they take a lot care of negotiating good conditions. So in the Italian system, the employed sector is quite well organized for occupational pensions, for supplementary pension. And I wanted to do this introduction because the problem that we see in terms of organizing something similar in the informal sector or in the even in the formal sector, but the sector of the self-employed, is that we do not have that kind of organizations like the trade unions, that they really take the responsibility to run the pension funds in the interest of members. And so the way the system is designed in Italy is that then we have commercial providers, so asset managers, banks, insurance companies that offer personal pension plans to the market, to anybody. But when they do that, they do it for profit. They, of course, in the management, they will do the interest of members, but first of all, they do the interest of themselves in terms of the prices that they charge. So if they can charge a higher price, they basically do. And it is difficult to manage that situation in the sense that you should introduce strong regulations like price caps, things like that, but that will reduce competition. So it is tricky. So let me say that in our system we have the problem, but we don't have the solution. I don't know if Ali or anybody else. Yeah, you can use this as you wish.
So, apologies, I'm going to be kind of not looking at you while I answer your question, but I can't quite turn enough degrees to do both. Okay, yeah, all right. So a lot of how this has been addressed, I don't think there's been an adequate solution quite yet, but I mentioned earlier that we have kind of the DB, the DC occupational systems, but there's also a way that you can save in a tax-qualified, kind of tax-advantaged manner on an individual basis. What we see that I think is universal and not unique to the US is that if you're working for an employer that has an occupational scheme, you're far more likely to save at much higher levels. And again, this is just part of human behavior. Everyone in the US, if you have earned income, you have the right to save some of that earned income in an individual thing. But if you don't have that kind of employment-based arrangement, you're not going to do it. That's even without auto-enrollment. Auto-enrollment obviously makes that disparity even more significant. The way it has been addressed is through that individual retirement savings mechanism. And there are companies that have kind of put forth products that try to get as close as they can to mimic the occupational schemes, but they're, as a technical matter, doing it through individual arrangements. But they're doing things like trying to create more economies of scale, trying to remove some of the administrative burden, the need to choose what you're investing in. They can simplify it so they can tie it to whatever your income stream is so that it's automatically deducted. It starts from an individual worker's perspective. It starts to look very similar to what they would get in a traditional employment relationship. One of the big drawbacks right now is that I mentioned that there are tax contribution limits. The contribution limits for those individual savings arrangements are very, very significantly lower than they are in the occupational schemes. There's also no legal way for you to get any kind of employer match. Even though you're not a common law employee, if you're an independent contractor, for example, you might want the person that's paying you to make some kind of match. There's not a straightforward way to do that in the individual scheme. So there are limitations under the current approaches. This is an area where there's a lot of interest in addressing it because not just the self-employed, those numbers have tended to increase post-COVID, but also people that have these kinds of alternative work arrangements like the gig economy. And then on your second question, I missed the second part of it. So as we increased access, and I didn't quite hear what you said.
As you increased access, was that coupled with compulsory preservation?
We didn't
sorry.
hear you, sorry. Could you speak more loudly?
Okay. I'll give it one more shot. As you increase, or now you've said that you've increased access, right? So that people, I suppose, aren't encouraged to just design to access their benefits. But I'm asking, is the access coupled with compulsory preservation? So in other words, for example, in South Africa, as you may know, we'll be introducing the two-part system. So that is basically where we will allow some access, but it's coupled with compulsory preservation. So it's basically 2/3 which members won't be able to touch until retirement funds. Of course, there are certain caveats, but that's essentially the principle.
So you're asking specifically about the emergency savings concept that I was talking about?
Yes, I'm asking,
Yeah.
are you also, in addition to the access, having any form of preservation?
Yeah, so there's very strict rules around, or principles around how that money can be invested. and it can't be invested the way a traditional retirement account could be invested. There are also limits, relatively low limits on what can be put in there. And typically what we are going to see is that the employer matches, for example. So if you're saving, you're a new employee, you're starting to save, the first little bit of your contributions will go to that emergency savings account. All of the employer matches from the beginning will go into your traditional account. And once you hit the cap, then your contributions also as an employee will also go into your traditional account. And so they're kind of segregated, even in the one where it's called a pension-linked emergency savings account.
Pablo, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I would like to mention something about informality, the first question. Obviously, as I said before, we have been interacting with countries, and informality is an important issue, Southeast Asia, Latin America, South Africa, many other countries, and we have learned experiences from different countries. And one of the key things in terms of what type of policies you might implement to bring the informal workers into saving for retirement is to try to understand the reasons why they don't save for retirement. For example, some of the people that don't save for retirement is basically because they don't have to, the self-employed. We learned that from countries like in Thailand or in Chile. They didn't have to, so why are they going to save? People don't save for retirement. They don't lock in savings for a long term. So the policy there is clear. You can create special plans through trade organizations, social partner negotiations, making compulsory for them or auto-enrollment that they have to participate. But of course, there is also the people that do not want to save for retirement. Some people don't want to save because they don't have the capacity to save. Their capacity to save is very low. So for those people, sometimes you just have the safety net. And there are people who just don't want to pay. They just are trying to, if you can use the expression, trying to trick the society. But and of course, that you have to use the enforcing rules in the system to make them. But now we are experiencing in many countries what people call non-standard forms of work. In the past, somebody had permanent job in a company and everything, but there are gig workers is one of the things, platform workers and all of that. Obviously, they have different features. Some of them have the feature that the income flows, their income is very erratic. They don't have permanent features, and many of the pension arrangements that exist in many countries do not allow them to be part of those pension arrangements. So the features that determine who can be a member or not need to change to be able to make them into the system. There are temporal seasonal workers that also don't fit in the standard definition of work. So, and we have collected all this information for the recommendation number 2 on the good design that is linked to inclusiveness, because we want a system to be inclusive. We want a system in which everybody at least have the opportunity to save. Yes, there are the ones who will try not to save, trying to break the law, things like that, but most people, they just don't have the means, so we have to create the means. I remember once talking in India, they have created what they call dedicated plans for low-income individuals with with erratic income flows, and that was a very interesting type of plan. So first, look at what are the reasons different groups don't save for retirement, and then depending on the reasons, you have different policies.
Yeah, thank you. You asked a very difficult question. Probably the area of informality is one of the most difficult to deal with. And probably the issue is that it is difficult to identify a system of incentives that works for the good provision of pension schemes good for the for people in the informal sector and for the individuals, the incentives for the individuals to go into the, so that is a very difficult question. But let's go to other questions. Please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Trisha Delou. I am from the Financial Services Commission of Mauritius. Actually, Ali, you have touched upon an interesting matter that is a matter of concern also at our end. With regards to pensions money getting lost due to job mobility of workers. So the experience we are having right now in Mauritius is that when we are giving approvals, for example, for winding ups of pension schemes, for shifts from DB to DC, or for bulk transfers from one pension scheme to another, what we find is that administrators who have the duty to administer pension schemes, well, basically they come with a long list of deferred members, whereby these members have left the service of the employer for many years ago, like you mentioned, and that they are unable to trace these members owing basically to details of members not being updated on a regular basis, or even workers leaving the country to go and work elsewhere, but not leaving details of their new residence or country of residence. So what I want to hear from you, from the panelists, is what could be a practical solution for operators, for administrators, knowing whereby that governing bodies, the trustees, have the fiduciary duty to ensure on many operations of the scheme, but unfortunately many of them don't have the time, so they delegate that service to operators like administrators. So what would be an efficient a practical solution, if you have any from your own experiences? And what can a regulator do at this point in time in order to ensure that people who are leaving their money behind, well, basically at the time of 50, 65, they are getting their pension benefits? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Anybody?
So, I'm just going to take this. I have a few thoughts. You know, a lot of what I heard from you is very, very reminiscent of the same conversation that we have in the United States. And the one thing I didn't hear you say is sometimes what we hear is, you know, we're trying to pay these people, but they actually don't want their money, which, you know, we've responded to that when that argument has been raised. The scope of the problem in the US is pretty significant. So through our enforcement program, over the past probably 5 or 6 years, there's been $1 billion every year that we have recovered in our, and again, if you think about the stats that I was telling you, one investigator every 12,500 plants, we're not very big compared to the universe that we're regulating. So this is a really significant problem. I think there are a couple of things. There's some guidance that we issued that I can send a copy to you. Some of it may or may not be applicable because part of this relies on data that people have access to. There are kind of locator tools that you can utilize to try and locate someone's new address. I'm not sure to what extent in the Mauritius that's going to be applicable. But I think one thing to think about is whether there is a government agency that's keeping track of where people are. That would kind of be the analog for you, and whether you can. So in the US, for example, part of why this problem became quite acute is that an agency called the Internal Revenue Service, our tax collection agency, used to run a service for the private sector where on these kinds of issues, you could send them correspondence and they would forward it to the right individual. Because obviously from a tax standpoint, maybe you're not telling your employer from 15 years ago that you've moved again. You are still, hopefully, and there's a lot of work to make sure this happens, you're filing your income taxes every year. So the tax collector has up-to-date address information. There's also kind of mail forwarding services that our postal service has. So I think one question is, what are those kinds of administrative bodies in your jurisdiction that might be of significant utility. The other thing I would say is this is an area where I think identifying it as a priority and making the regulators' expectations clear is quite important, because for us there's two problems. There's the people that have historically been lost, and one of the things that we're trying to make sure doesn't happen is on a going forward basis, people aren't continuing to be lost. And so emphasizing this as a trustee priority, identifying some of our lessons learned. So one of the things we have realized is that when one of two things happens, it's particularly likely that people are going to get lost. One is a corporate merger, acquisition, that kind of transaction. The other is if the scheme is moving from one service provider to another. And in that context, a lot of records can get lost. And so making sure that in those circumstances, they're paying really close attention.
Júlia.
In my jurisdiction, it's a little bit easy because we have a state agency. We call it a social state agency, and every legally employed person, his employer should to send the record, and also the contribution for the both two pillars are directly distributed via this agency. Additional, I don't want to say about the some informal. We don't have this problem that, but some work which are a little bit out of the system. Okay, these people, we try to educate them that if you don't sending the contribution, don't be surprised that you will not have pensions. But I think that is a little bit different problem. But what about the people who are really have saving the whole life? Already you can check your work track in the social agency, and I can see the big challenges in the fintech. We already start to use the technology, but my expectation that it was the speed will be much higher. But in the some country, you can see the digitalization of the record, and it's a much more easy to find and to identify the potential gap, a mistake. Because what's used to happen, that people exactly before the leaving in the pensions recognize, because I think that you can ask for the recalculation or calculation of the pensions, I don't know, 6 months or 1 year before you're leaving into the pensions, and you can check if the all income incorporated in your pensions. And in that time, people sometimes to recognize that part of their job was lost. But it was the splitting of Czechoslovakia. It was the main reason that people was living in the different country. But we have an agreement between the country about the exchange of information. It's more or less work that you there also then Czech have a state social agency. But I can imagine if the whole registered, it's tax register, social registers, and property register, and we are in the plan million register, it will be easily matching, this problem will be relatively quickly solved, and also will be able to recognize the gaps since the beginning, because now the people are able to recognize the problem before the living in the pensions, because how many of them are checking if their record is properly done in the agency? But I think there is a big challenge for the digitalization.
Yeah, no, thank you. If I can add just a few words, the technology in principle could be very helpful in putting all the information in the same place. That is basically the point. In Europe in particular, there are initiatives at the European Union level to introduce an obligation for countries to build so-called pension tracking systems. So basically obliging member countries to put in the same place all the information on public pensions, private pensions, and make them available to individuals. And that would mean also a real improvement in terms of the possibility to plan and to understand what will be the sum of all the pieces that you may have been earned in your life. Obviously, this is something that probably can be done quite easily from now and looking forward, but all the pieces that matured in the past, it is a challenge to get them collected.
Ambrogio almost said everything I was going to say. In some countries they call it dashboards. The European Union call it a tracking system. Basically the idea is that all pension funds have to put all the information there. Ambrogio is right that that is a solution going forward for people who already have double, triple accounts. I will advise you to talk with my friends from Australia because they have been dealing with that problem and they have implemented several things. But the idea is to have dashboard or tracking system, as the European Union called them, where all the information of all the accounts is registered. So, because job mobility is a problem everywhere and people is changing. And DC pension plans, one of the purpose was to carry them with you. But sometimes it's not possible because they are occupational and they are related to your employer and all these kind of things. But if they are all registered in these dashboards, the UK is also developing dashboards. I don't recommend you to talk with them because they are still fighting how it will be done. Somebody from the UK back there is laughing because they haven't decided yet. But talk with Australia, they have done that. And yes, the tracking system or dashboards, as it's called in other countries, is the way to address the problem.
So our time is already over of this session, but I would like to take one other question, please.
Thank you. I'm Eric Chang from the Mandatory Provident Fund Schemes Authority from Hong Kong, China. In the panel discussion just now, Ali mentioned about the equity issue in voluntary contribution system. I think this is very relevant because inevitably most of the voluntary contributions will be made by middle class workers. I'm curious about how to measure this equity quantitatively or qualitatively. And a connected issue is this equity about tax incentive provided. How can we prove to the Treasury or the legislature that in the absence of tax incentive for voluntary contributions, those voluntary contributions would not be made? Because if you could not prove this counterfactual, then it's legitimate for the legislator to ask why bother to waste this tax revenue on incentivizing voluntary contributions for just a particular segment of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. Volunteers?
So I think there are individuals in the U.S. that would say that the tax incentives are wasted. It is one of the highest government expenditures. There's an interest credit you can get for mortgages, and then these kinds of occupational schemes. Those two are the two highest, and they kind of flip which one is higher than the other. I think in terms of proving the counterfactual, that is difficult. One of the things that you might want to consider is in various parts of the US, one of the things that we are sometimes able to do is get authority to do a demonstration project or a pilot. And it's done with the intention of gathering data. If the results are successful, then you go back to your legislative body and you say, look, I now have proof that this does exactly what we thought it would do. I mean, that's one approach. This might be a bit too tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's also fair to say that rational economic actors aren't going to save because they don't have an incentive. And if you're providing an incentive to save, there's only one direction that's going to go. But that may be a bit too flip for...
Sorry.
In my jurisdiction, before introductions every incentives or every measures which have an impact for the public debt, we have an office which we call the value for money, and you should to give the quantification which give you the evidence that it's the right steps. And we recognize that the tax incentives, it's a more stronger tools how to motivate a people saving. I would like to remind the discussion in the OECD, I think that it was a few years ago in the Working Party private pensions, what kind of incentives could work, and I think that tax incentives was the most common and mostly used and mostly work. And what about evaluation of the equity? It depends what kind of assets are in the funds. We don't have a real problem with evaluation because it's a majority of these is in the stock exchange, or that's we have IFRS principles, and it should be evaluation. We had a principle. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Júlia.
One quick.
Actually, there is a very recent study by the OECD, by the...
Yes, that's what I was going to talk.
Session of Pablo. Please, Pablo.
The key thing is, in terms of equity and how you evaluate it, first you have to decide what is your objective. For example, one simple thing that people always forget. A pay-as-you-go public pension system is also tax advantage. To start with, in a public pension system, there are tax incentives. And you might argue, well, it's mandatory, why do you want tax incentives? But this is one of the comparators. But then what is your objective? There are countries that their key objective of tax incentive, and this is something you always hear from the US, is to increase domestic savings. And we had the minister. For other countries, like the countries that already have high domestic savings, that's not the purpose, but maybe they want tax incentives to reallocate savings that are not earmarked for retirement and they are short-term to long-term savings that are earmarked for retirement. So that also can be a purpose. Then you have to think, okay, tax incentives only benefits people who file income tax. In many countries, middle income down don't file income tax. So if your purpose is that they should, you are targeting them to increase the coverage in middle to low income people, then what it seems to work from the experience of a few countries, and I can tell you which countries, is matching and subsidies. And that's why the matching contributions and all of that works quite well in countries like the US and many countries, and they are introducing them, because it can be designed in a way that the incentive does not increase with income, is constant through the income scale.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. We are already 10 minutes over. We could, or probably we should continue discussing, but we will continue discussing in the other sessions. Thank you very much for your active participation, and we thank all the speakers. Please join me.